All right, dear colleagues, students all over the world, welcome to the webinar in October at CUHK. Welcome all to this very special webinar. We have a distinguished guest from University of Sydney, Australia. She is streaming in from far away, the south side of the earth, on a topic of tremendous concern to most of us. At least it appears on the news virtually every day. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. Olga Boichak. She is my colleague. She is a sociologist of media and culture. Currently, she is a lecturer in digital cultures at the University of Sydney in the Department of Media and Communication. Dr. Boichak had an interdisciplinary social science PhD from Syracuse University. Therefore, she had an interdisciplinary background, not only as a sociologist, as she self-identified as, she has background in public administration and media science, communication science. She has been working on a number of interesting topics that spans across both quantitative method, big data, as well as ethnographic methodology. She thus brings to us a very special angle in looking at the world around us. In particular, the topic today is about networked humanitarianism in the context of the Russian war against Ukraine. This is a timely topic, but at the same time, it exemplifies how computational social science can help us tackle big problems affecting the world around us. And without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Boichak. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Tam. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have never been at the Chinese University of Hong Kong in person, but I had the best time at the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science, and I see some familiar faces in the audience, and I'm just really, really excited to be talking about networked humanitarianism, because I do think that over the past 10 years, there have been different paradigms in our understanding of the role of social and digital media in humanitarianism in particular, and I wanted for us today to critically interrogate some of the assumptions. Before I start, I'm joining from the land of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. The Gadigal people is where the University of Sydney stands. These are unceded lands. As you know, this is a very exciting and decisive time in Australia's history as well, with regard to the Indigenous voice referendum. This is something that networked engagement and networked activism also plays an extremely important role in. And so it's really me trying to kind of bring some of the strands of thought together and trying to understand really in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, the role that digital media played therein. I am myself Ukrainian, born and raised. I then, like Professor Tam mentioned, did my master's and my PhD at Syracuse University in the company with great colleagues. And really, it is my attempt to straddle some of the more information science approaches, data science approaches, with some of the more traditional questions in the social science. And just trying to not be deterministic as we do so, and trying to hopefully answer some questions today. So today I would like to talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Just a bit of a pretext, as many of you probably know this very well, but I just kind of wanted to reiterate the beginnings of Russia's invasion because as I'm sure you would know, this war had not started in 2022. It's been ongoing since 2014. In February 2014, Russia had illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula, which was surrendered without a single shot fired. in an effort to not provoke the Russian army, not to provoke Vladimir Putin for military violence. And that appeasement has not been successful. And very soon, Russia had orchestrated the so-called separatist republics in the east of Ukraine. And so there has been fighting ongoing since 2014, pretty much. And since the start, even before, since Ukraine had its revolution of dignity in 2013 and 14, there have been networks, social networks, and we can think of human networks or a combination between human networks and social media or socially mediated human networks that had been engaged in humanitarianism. And so since there had been military casualties, civilian casualties, there were people in the conflict-affected territories that needed support. And so since then, we could see the emergence of this networked humanitarianism that had been extremely excited for me as a scholar of social movements back then. And so I've been researching it since then, and I've been looking at various kinds of volunteering, various kinds of civic engagement, civic digital cultures surrounding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And of course, fast forward 8 years, February 2022, those of us who have studied this war were extremely concerned to see the military buildup. You probably remember those times, that tension and that kind of discussion, will Putin invade, will he not? With the onset of the full-scale invasion, what was surprising is that it was really unexpected by many analysts, the fact that Ukraine not only held the defense for more than 3 days, which was relegated to its capture by the Russian army, but that actually it was surprisingly well organized, well supplied, well equipped, and ready. And so that is something, that's a phenomenon that if one had looked at these networks during the previous years, they were always there. It's just that they were able to mobilize and really resist the occupation, which was so remarkable. But I guess this was something that in a way flew under the radar, because Ukraine somehow had been thought to have a weak civil society. Volunteering, there was no culture of volunteering in Ukraine prior to 2014. But during those 8 years, there had been remarkable social processes, processes where there was a development of social trust, development of social cohesion, somehow perhaps the strengthening of the social fabric that was happening in the country that enabled Ukraine to still stand as we now speak, and to really, for us to witness all of these processes. But also what's remarkable is that it sparked such widespread international involvement, and it came in so many forms. Basically, that is the essence, I guess, of the idea of participative war, that each social media user that's equipped with a smartphone, with a camera, with any digital device can now participate in these remote conflicts and remote wars, challenge the course, but also the outcomes of them. And so for those of you who have seen, there's been a lot of unprecedented international engagement in Twitter. There are whole digitally mediated collectives, but also I wanted for us to be a little more critical too, because this is also, so we're in 2023, and this is 10 years since Bennett and Segerberg's logic of connective action has come out. And so this is a very good occasion to, I guess, reflect on some of the assumptions made by Bennett and Segerberg that was, I guess, revolutionary when that paper first came out. And many of us have since used connective action as the framework of that to explain our work, or to, I guess, justify our methods sometimes. And in computational methods, that's particularly relevant, because finally we had a theory that would allow us to analyze all of this digitally mediated communication. But I guess I would like for us today to be a little bit critical of that approach, and to really look at the human networks that are at the core of this digitally mediated action, even if it's dispersed, even if it's international. So with the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022 in February, there has been this growing disenchantment regarding the role of international organizations, particularly organizations such as the United Nations, humanitarian organizations that in really living up to their mandate and providing humanitarian support to those who were harmed by the war, including which are predominantly civilians. And as you would know, in Ukraine, that is, civilians seem to be the most attacked targets. Objects of civilian infrastructure are increasingly targeted, and a lot of the times these are shopping malls or hospitals or schools. And the kind of the lack of an adequate response by international organizations. So this was a prank. This was taken in Kyiv. This was a UN car, which a Kyiv-based blogger just decided to sort of decorate. And this was right after the Kakhovka Dam explosion in June 2023. And so this was something that I guess represented the sort of growing sense of disenchantment surrounding the role of international organizations. As you might remember, in July 2023, Russia presided over the United Nations Security Council, which just seemed very antithetical for those Ukrainians who felt like the UN could have taken a stronger position. So funnily enough, the blogger, the prankster, got fined. It was an administrative, well, he broke some administrative law. He had to pay a fee for this act of hooliganism. But in a way, it's sort of in a bit of a sarcastic manner. It does capture the disenchantment with a lot of international organizations. This is Amnesty International. Again, in mid 2022, they issued a very controversial report on Ukraine, where one of their key arguments was that Ukrainian soldiers endanger civilians by being in the immediate proximity to civilian objects and to civilians, which caused a tremendous amount of backlash among Ukrainian activists, because for those who had been in the Russian occupied territories, they understood that Ukrainian soldiers were the only force preventing civilians from different kinds of atrocities. And so in that way, Amnesty International's report, under the guise of neutrality, missed some crucial humanitarian context in which that report was being written. And therefore, that is kind of, again, just a depiction, an artistic depiction of the disenchantment that a lot of Ukrainians and the international community had experienced because of the Amnesty International's response. Here we see the president of the International Red Cross Committee visiting Russia, shaking hands with Sergei Lavrov, which was another, concerning act because this is supposed to be a neutral organization. In fact, there had been some investigations about the ICRC supporting the Russian army, their Russian offices contributing to some of the humanitarian support, and so that also, I must say, did not land well and was heavily criticized for kind of this, I guess, omission of the crucial context. So that is just what's happening in the international arena. We have these large, well-established international organizations with a very strong history of humanitarianism that have somehow either misinterpreted or somehow misrepresented what was happening, and therefore their response was deemed insufficient or highly offensive to that matter. And on the other hand, we have these absolutely unlikely actors, and these are always anecdotal, right? Without any systematic history. Well, we have these media stories of children collecting cash to purchase certain things to help the population in the affected territories, donating cars to evacuate, for example, the wounded civilians from the war zones and things like that. And that is something, I guess, it's always heartwarming to see these stories, but it is indicative of a much broader set of social processes that I wanted to partially talk about today. So here we see a girl who was a chess player, and what she did, she had adults play chess against her, and if they lost, they had to pay her some symbolic amount. And here she is with a prominent volunteer. You can see that he's he has been crying when he saw when she took the money out of her bag and she asked, please buy something useful for the people who need it. Please support. We are supporting our soldiers. We understand that this is something that that we have to do. And so here's a stockpile of cash that this girl had won over months of playing chess with people in the public. Here's this little boy who was supposed to be getting a bike, who has decided to donate cash. So these are 2022 examples. This is an example that got me down the rabbit hole of studying networked humanitarianism back in 2015. This was a 10-year-old American boy of Ukrainian descent who decided to run a birthday fundraiser, again, to purchase an SUV for the Ukrainian army. And while that is really a generous act and a selfless act, we also can't help but notice that this is a minor citizen of a foreign country who has done this. And so this brings our attention to the so-called social infrastructures, to the networks of people and technologies, if you will, that had to be in place for this to even happen. So this should have taken up to 30 people or maybe even more for this stockpile of birthday cash to transform into something tangible and end up somewhere in a military conflict far away. In this instance, it is a car, because they usually get destroyed very quickly in the case in conflicts. And so a lot of the times, those who are doing civilian evacuation, for example, who are providing medical care close to the battlefronts, they go through a lot of cars, and there's always a need. So in a way, this is kind of foregrounding these social infrastructures, because a lot of the times using our smartphones or using different platforms like Uber Eats, things seem to just magically appear at our doorstep. And it in fact takes so many layers and so many connections between people to make it happen. And so I guess that's part of the rationale for looking deeper into these forms. This is actually, I didn't know what to make of it. I saw this on Twitter. It's from a young child. As you can see by handwriting, it is very kind of uncertain. So I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years old, who said, I wanted to buy Robux, which is a Roblox currency, but please, I would like to donate this money, and please write my name. So this guy particularly wanted to purchase a drone, and he said, please write my name on that drone, and here's my Roblox handle. So kids as little as 7 or 8 years old already feel the obligation to somehow support Ukraine's resistance to occupation. And in these instances, we can see that there's very many. This is just a few examples that sort of scratch the surface. So what I've done previously is I've interviewed many of those who are currently in Ukraine, who identify as volunteers, who actually provide for those who constitute those social infrastructures. When I say volunteers, I don't mean in any way voluntary battalions or volunteers who actually fight with weapons. These are the people who run the logistical supply chains, who run different kinds of support, who run medical evacuation, who provide different kinds of goods to people in the affected areas and things like that. So these are purely civilians who don't have any military connection, but they just have found it in them to be able to, to do some work. And of course, it's unpaid work to contribute to Ukraine's resistance in that sense, and they've been very active since 2014. And so this is a research that I've done with Brian McKernan from my alma mater, from Syracuse University. We've looked at volunteers sustaining norms of engaged citizenship. So as opposed to more of a duty-based citizenship where citizens feel like they're obligated to do something or they're required to do something, engaged citizenship is about the values of communitarianism, the values, sort of more humanist values, if you will, knowing that there are people who require help in my country, and therefore I will do everything that I can to help them. And so these are the networks that I'm really interested in, and so over time, what these volunteers have done is they have changed the norms, changed what it means to be a Ukrainian in a sense of that civic kind of liberal kind of identity, and changed the culture of engaged citizenship. These are figures of a report that, well, it's not very recent, and there's a huge caveat that it's difficult to do surveys in Ukraine right now because of the amount of the number of displaced persons, of the number of persons that had left the country and or have been displaced or have lost their lives. But in the survey that they were able to do, they find that 38% of Ukraine's adult population were involved in volunteering in 2022. So that is up to 10 million, or maybe even more than 10 million, looking at the population that had left, that volunteer or consider themselves as volunteers. Roughly half of these have started in or after February 2022. 54% of those who volunteered prior to Russia's full-scale invasion now volunteer more. 25 of those who are not involved, 25% plan to get involved the next year. And over 60% of those who volunteer found out about opportunities on social media and specialized online resources. So I think that is pretty significant, because oftentimes, kind of like with me and my whole dissertation, it can start with a little boy with a handful of cash, or people just see different posts by others collecting donations, usually to purchase something that is urgently needed. And 84% of volunteers plan to continue into 2023. So these are some of the areas of volunteering, which I also thought was interesting. So 32% volunteer in the humanitarian response headquarters. That is creating, especially during the winter time, places where people can, places with like heaters, indoor heating, where people can come in, be warm, make themselves a cup of tea, charge their phone. With the increasing attacks on Ukraine's critical civilian infrastructure, there have been massive blackouts, and it is a reality of living in Ukraine right now that there's oftentimes no electricity and no power, and people need some alternative ways of staying warm. Helping the Ukrainian armed forces, 22%, that would be different kinds of, from first aid kits to different body armor, personal protective equipment, hygiene supplies, tea, biscuits, you name it, just really collecting donations on behalf of the Ukrainian armed forces, only 14%, but that is something that the Ukrainian armed forces officially might require or wouldn't supply to the soldiers. Coordinating humanitarian response, 11%, collecting donations on behalf of IDPs, and so counseling and delivering cars, it's only 2%. But this is kind of a breakdown of what the social infrastructures within Ukraine are doing. So today I wanted to focus on two questions. One, what is the role of networked humanitarianism in geopolitical crisis, given that we are observing these phenomena that are perhaps somewhat under-theorized? And what is the place for networked humanitarianism in online conversations surrounding Russia's invasion of Ukraine? So these are the two questions that I would like to reflect on, and I would like to, so this is a roadmap. I would like to talk a little bit about the literature on networked humanitarianism in geopolitical crisis, and then look at the case of the Kakhovka Dam explosion as one of the biggest anthropogenic catastrophes of this century for sure, but is reminiscent of the catastrophes of the previous centuries, of Chernobyl, particularly, where critical infrastructure was being weaponized to destroy those who are around it or those who use it. And because these are large infrastructural projects, of course, the outcomes of their destruction are the scale is extremely large. And talk about some key considerations going forward. So there's some literature that perhaps helps us make sense of some of those things that we're observing. There is a growing body of literature on participatory war, started famously by William Merrin, who's an associate professor at Swansea, but also, so just meaning anyone with a smartphone being able to participate and kind of challenge the course and the outcomes of wars. There's the diffused war theorized by Hoskins and O'Loughlin, that is actually quite an old theory, basically meaning that there is diffused centers of control and diffused centers of influence in military conflicts. I did work on battlefront assemblages, trying to theorize the role of human and technological actants surrounding those spaces. And radical war is more of the digital information ecologies that surround wars at present. Then there's literature on networked involvement in geopolitical events. And a lot of that literature has to do with diasporas. The definition of diasporas is not clear-cut. It's actually much more broader and much more nuanced than just thinking of people living outside of their country of origin. One doesn't become a diaspora automatically. And it has been observed by many different authors that wars and conflicts in the homeland do cement those networked communities. They strengthen their sense of identity, and we could see it surrounding many different crisis events, catastrophic events, wars. We can observe that with the case of the Hamas attack on Israel. There is that strengthened sense of a national identity, of solidarity with the people who had been harmed in this attack. And so every time there is something in the homeland, there are these conflict-generated communities that stand against it, for example, or that raise different resources to help their communities in crisis. And what diasporas are particularly good at is they actually know and they can identify the needs of the communities in some spaces where those might be missed by international organizations, just because they know the context very well and they know what could be needed. There's also literature on the links between the war front and the home front. So looking at the public as well as platform-mediated spaces for grassroots storytelling and activism. So on social media, on different platforms, each and every one of us can write our own story, frame the events in our own way, and in that sense, contribute to the representation of those events. Dromi has a very interesting book on the Protestant ethic. Dromi is a sociologist, and Tony probably might know him. So Dromi has a book on the Red Cross and on the Protestant ethics that informs the history of that organization. And he has first made that observation that humanitarianism has moved from the margins of the global geopolitical landscape towards its center. And because, again, some of these very large humanitarian actors, of course, there are also major geopolitical actors, but also there are smaller diffused actors that we shouldn't disregard in this space. And so this is my work with Tanya Lockhart, where we looked at the network communities becoming more powerful and significant actors in crisis events. And of course, again, there's a large heterogeneity and diversity within that networked engagement patterns. There's also literature on social infrastructures, which is helpful because that's coming from information science. Brian Simon and Jeff Hemsley, my mentors from Syracuse University, they were talking about 4 things that define these platform or technologically assisted humanitarian actors or social infrastructures. Social redundancy, which is the idea that anyone can step in. So if you think of a network of people, for example, the United States has older historical examples of the Underground Railroad, where people were sort of part of this movement. They were all on the same page, but they were almost redundant and they were replaceable. It really didn't matter who the person one would be dealing with was, because they all identified as part of that network and they all worked towards a commonly defined goal. So that is this idea of social redundancy, that there's many faces, and it's really not built on any familial networks, not built on any professional communities. It is really practically whoever is there gets to contribute. Social diversity is, again, an incredible an extremely important component to those social infrastructures, because usually they bring together people from all walks of life. And a lot of the times from my experience speaking with volunteers, they have practically nothing in common. And a lot of the times people admit that these are the people who I would maybe not be interacting with, and if not for the war, if not for the need to work together. And sometimes it's really incredible. Sometimes I would hear anecdotes about, just someone coming and meeting a bus driver and asking if the bus driver can deliver some kinds of fabrics into a different city where some person who they've never met will saw something that is very needed and then would deliver somewhere else. So the social diversity is really an important component. There's the fluidity between invisibility and visibility. That is what makes them so incredibly hard to study, because we see all the networked communication. It's just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of it is happening in private messages. A lot of it is happening in person over the phone. There's really this fluidity also across platforms, which is a major limitation if we are to study just a single platform. And of course, social trust, which is extremely important, and platforms do help mediate it in many different ways, but it's much easier to verify who the person is based on a mutual network of connections. And also many other platforms have ways of sort of validating or improving some of that social trust. You can think of things like Uber, where each driver has a rating, and that sort of is a metric that represents, in a way, which is flawed, but it does represent the social trust that is afforded to that user. So the Kakhovka Dam explosion, it was a hydroelectric plant. It was exploded early in the morning of the 6th of June, 2023, considered as an act of ecocide, one of the largest anthropogenic disasters of the past decades. It was destroyed by Russia, even though what is really significant is for the first week, there had been these unending discourses of who has done it. Is it Russia? Russia says it's Ukraine. Ukraine says it's Russia. And the media coverage kind of reflected that. So it's like Ukraine and Russia accuse each other of blowing up the Kakhovka Dam, which was also very unhelpful because the left bank of the Dnipro River, which predominantly got flooded, was Russian occupied territory. The Kakhovka Dam itself was on the Russian occupied territory. And that ended up to loss of life for many people, because Russia continued to deny it, and these people had not been evacuated. So that was, and of course, because it was Russian occupied territory, the Ukrainian volunteers could not get there because there was a lot of risk for life. There were very few people who were able to escape. Dnipro is a very wide and fast river, and so it was not a safe passage for them from the left bank to the right to the Ukrainian controlled territory. But overall, it caused a tremendous loss of life. And meanwhile, while there was a lot of kind of squabbles, who did it, why did they do it, why would they do it if it wasn't in their benefit, and things like that, there wasn't a lack of humanitarian response. There weren't any first responders. The international organizations, of course, decided not to get involved because there was a lot of risk for it's a wartime, it's a war zone, so there's a lot of risk, and there's that. But also there were smaller kind of humanitarian rescue efforts organized by people, and so the city of Kherson, that was 30 kilometers downstream from the Novokakhovka Dam, got massive flooding. There were a lot of whole villages that got kind of obliterated with that flooding. That was not an unprecedented act. What is significant is that in 1941, Stalin actually ordered the Red Army to blow the Dnipro Dam. And that was, so this incident, which was also, it was not a great strategic maneuver, because it pretty much ended up with a loss of life among the Red Army at the time. So, so I guess there was also a massive discussion online whether it was in Russia's strategic interest to blow it up, or whether they might not have, so things like that. But it's, of course, now it's known, it's well known that Russia was the one that had blown it up. But in any case, there had been historical parallels of these massive infrastructural objects being blown up. These are finally, we're getting into the computational social science realm. I hope that those of you who came here for it weren't too bored with my long preface. After all, I was trying to set explain the context a little bit better. But what my team and I have done, so I've been working with two PhD students, Katerina Kasyanenko and Justin Miller. This is our project. And what we've done, we have collected social media posts that had terms Kherson or Kakhovka over the time. So the 5th of June is one day before the dam got exploded, and up to the 15th. So over a 10 day period, we have collected all of the public posts that were on those platforms. We used CrowdTangle to collect data from Facebook and Instagram. And as you see, these are very different numbers because traditionally we think that Twitter is where those conversations are at. The affordances of Twitter make it a really good platform for sharing news. And also the fact that we are speaking to the public, to the broader public without our walled gardens, was probably beneficial for people who wanted to either get current news or wanted to share something. So that's hence the discrepancy in the number of posts. And of course, I'm assuming that there had been a lot more private posts that we're not seeing and weren't able to collect. Twitter posts were collected using Twitter API version 2, which had since regretfully been shut down. And now Twitter is a very, very strange platform that's getting increasingly less moderated, just really interesting phenomena happening there. I like to think that we still captured the bulk of the online communication that was happening. Of course, there's another social media, and that's Telegram, which is becoming a very prominent space for people to share news. Telegram is a little strange because there's news channels, but there's not a lot of public discussion around it. So it's pros and cons, but I guess this is what we got. And if you look at the percents of total posts per platform, you could see that on Twitter, it was about up to 3% of the whole discussion. On Facebook and Instagram, there was slightly around 2% of the overall volume of conversation on those days was dedicated to the Kakhovka Dam explosion. So that's pretty significant. And also looking at the volumes of communication, Twitter seems disproportionately large volume, but in fact, if we look at all of the tweets, they're pretty comparable in terms of the overall volume of discourse. Looking at the followers and user interactions. So the average follower count for those who posted on Twitter was in fact significantly lower than for those who posted on Facebook and for those who posted on Instagram, which is again, because there are so many accounts and so much conversation, the reach, or at least for those posts that don't go viral, was probably slightly more limited than on these other platforms. And average total interactions per post was something that we just we couldn't believe, because Instagram this is a different order of magnitude with which people on Instagram interacted with those posts. This is a little puzzling because anecdotally, and this is something that a lot of Ukrainians have shared with me, that they have stopped using Instagram because of that context collapse that is afforded by that platform. Because when there's wartime and when there's really very devastating events happening almost on a daily basis, Instagram with the influencers and different beauty products and lifestyle and things just didn't feel right for them. So they felt like on Twitter and on Facebook, they could curate their information flows and really stay up to date, receive crucial civic information that they needed sometimes to survive. Whereas Instagram, it was really difficult to moderate some of that content, and some of it felt so irrelevant to them at that time that they had abandoned the platform. And yet we see how many interactions users actually have done with Instagram. And part of it is probably the visual mediation of crisis events that offers some of these rich visuals that are so appealing to users that they interact with. These are the interactions over time. So we see that Instagram was very kind of in the early days following the disaster was very popular. So this is our method that we used. We collected data over a 10-day period. We cleaned it, deduplicated. We translated all emoji because we thought they might offer some useful context to the effect that we can observe in those posts, and we compiled them all into a single text corpus. I would be really keen to hear your feedback on it or some of the comments, because the reason we did that is because we really wanted to look at cross-platform engagement, and we wanted to see how those patterns, we wanted to have a sort of the common denominator for analyzing those patterns on those platforms in ways that are interoperable and sort of legible for each platform in particular. So that was the rationale. Then we used sentence level BERT. So we used a transformer-based architecture to convert strings into a numeric format. We got 512 dimensional vectors, and we deployed the Gaussian mixture modeling for clustering vectorized data, and thus obtained 10 clusters. I will admit that the figure 10 is somewhat arbitrary. It was manageable for us to work with 10 clusters, but then what we did is we validated those 10 clusters, and then we did hierarchical clustering to see whether there's also variability within those clusters to help us maybe understand some of those clusters better. We were pretty happy with the results, actually, even though those were posted in different languages. That was new. I'm a very big fan of semantic networks. I usually work with semantic networks. I love them to the extent that I can't put into words. Transformer-based architecture was a bit of an experiment, but so far it yielded interesting insights, and I'd be keen to hear your experiences of using that. I wouldn't even say that this is topic modeling, because honestly, all of those posts belong to a single topic. They were all on the Kakhovka Dam explosion. So I also think we should be critical in calling it topic modeling. Maybe we can look at different other ways to explain what it is that we're doing with these very large volumes of text that do not involve the concepts of topic modeling. What I've done with semantic networks, I've done narrative analysis, and I find that they're extremely helpful in delineating some of the narratives that are happening around events. It's nice to see words in context. Here, we pretty much found different patterns of discussing the Kakhovka Dam explosion as it was happening. Then we are now in the process of validation, of full validation. So we have a statistically representative sample of each cluster that the two of us are validating. We're measuring our intercoder reliability. So this is a work in progress. I cannot really attest to all of these clusters being exactly correct. We might rename them slightly, or maybe get rid of some of them altogether, but that's where we're at. And looking at networked humanitarian initiatives, whatever that means in this context, which is also interesting. So these are the 9 clusters that we have, the 10 clusters that we have found. So we surprisingly detected an instance of orchestrated, coordinated behavior, and that was surrounding the Azerbaijan relief efforts. Azerbaijan apparently had deployed armies of, I won't speak about the nature of these accounts because I simply don't know, but there were a lot of posts on Azerbaijan saving the day in Ukraine and deploying humanitarian aid, and that was very outstanding in a sense that it was just not, other countries didn't do that or in that volume, so that was separate. I don't know, maybe they did deploy some humanitarian aid, but there was a lot of conversation about it in different languages. There have been effective expressions of or attributions of guilt, and we could see there was empathy, there was outrage, there was celebration and support for Ukraine's humanitarian rescue missions, for Ukraine's armed forces. For example, there was a post saying, if you've been looking for a fitting moment to help Ukraine, that is it. And then there's different kinds of context in which and what is needed. There was attribution of guilt. There were a lot of discussions on the Russian army that had mined the dam earlier that year. And so even in theory, Ukraine does not have missile weapons powerful enough to demolish a hydroelectric power plant. So there were discourses of attribution of guilt. Then there were description of devastation caused by the accident and by of the evacuation efforts. That is where a lot of fundraising happened, where people would be raising funds for like inflatable boats with engines and things like that to be able to evacuate some of the residents that perhaps had been elderly or disabled or were not able to evacuate themselves. There was description of situation on the ground, very detailed accounts eyewitness accounts of different villages that were, because the water level were rising fast. We're talking about thousands of square kilometers being rapidly flooded. That kind of, and so there was the kind of real-time updates of the strategic and operational situation. And there was rescue efforts, but what is remarkable is that there were so many images and posts about animals. And it's remarkable because, of course, the internet is for cats. And of course, we know that animals drive user engagement online. However, in this context, it was really interesting because these were animals that were rescued by different rescuers. And unfortunately, many animals could not be rescued because people were being prioritized. But those animals that were rescued sort of became like heroes. And somebody even rescued a mouse from water, and that mouse then was photographed with many different people. There was really this very widespread public interest surrounding animals. And one way to explain it is that probably because it was uncertain and that it was really difficult to fact check who blew up the Kakhovka Dam, because nobody could get close to it. It was Russian occupied territory. It was not safe to be anywhere in the vicinity to take photos, to verify what really happened. Showing the animals, the wet animals taken out of the floods, was a way to humanize the situation and show the scale of devastation without going into unproductive discourses of blame attribution at the time when so many people needed to be rescued. So then attribution of guilt. So there were opposing camps, some people saying it's Russia, some people saying it's Ukraine. Then, like I said, strategic rationale. Why would Russia blow up if it wasn't in their interests? Well, historically, they've done it. And yeah, the different discourses. But yes, overall, it was really Russia's position, and the way that they denied having perpetrated this war crime actually made it really difficult to make out the truth, because it kind of drowned out all of the discourse around it that attributed it to Russia. Then there were calling out of Russia's actions in Ukraine in general, so war crimes, atrocities, perpetrating ecocide. There were diplomatic statements, and this is another significant finding, that even though we like to talk about many different, that platforms sort of are for the broader public, diplomatic institutions, government bodies, government representatives have a very prominent space in all of the social media platforms. Then we see a lot of media hashtags, URLs, imagery being shared, news and discussion of consequences, and then some uncategorized general comments. That was another cluster. This is if we do dimensionality reduction, if we look at the clustering in the two-dimensional space, we can see kind of how it looks like. It's perhaps not particularly informative, but we can see that, for example, there's a cluster of links and media sharing that seems to be not connected. There's a lot of blaming Russia for the destruction, and the news and diplomatic statements sort of permeate the whole ecosystem. We can see attribution of guilt. We can see discussion of consequences. So all of these, it's not very modular, but that is the nature of any kinds of platform mediated conversations that are on a single topic. They will inevitably be kind of lumped together, but we can still make up. And so this was our hierarchical clustering exercise, where we had looked at those subclusters, and the animal subcluster was something that was particularly interesting for us, but also we could distinguish, for example, attribution of guilt, those who were saying Russia did it, those who were saying Ukraine did it. The subclustering allowed us to separate some of those conversations. This is the temporal patterns of cluster posting. We see Azerbaijan relief efforts peaking on the 5th day after the the 4th day of the incident, which was a little off. But we can see those kind of standard or usual circadian rhythms where people post during the day and then sleep during the night, and that's just what it always looks like. This is interesting because if we're ranking the the number of followers of some of those accounts who posted some of those posts, we can see that news, that diplomatic statements and government accounts have the largest average number of followers, and that makes a lot of sense. We can see that there's uncategorized, it's unclear, it's probably just not very well classified. Attribution of guilt was another topic that had more followers than the others. Here are destruction and evacuation efforts, discussion of consequences, effective expression, sort of most likely, which is my reading of it, have been perpetrated or have been posted by people with fewer followers, so by the broader public, media, hashtags and such. But if we look at the number of interactions, we see that evacuation efforts had been disproportionately more interacted with than even diplomatic statements. So that does tell us something about the dynamic between those different actors, that their public is engaging perhaps even more with some of these more kind of horizontal humanitarian efforts. But still, we can see that diplomatic institutions and government representatives are significant actors in this ecosystem. So just a brief conclusion, because I do realize I'm slightly over time. What does it mean? Why should we care? This is one of the animal photos taken by my colleague, by my fellow Fulbrighter, Serhiy Korobainy. There was a dog that got paralyzed because the water was so cold, and it got taken out, and you see it clutching at the leg of its rescuer. First person witnessing testimony really were prominently featured in the discussions of the Kakhovka Dam explosion. And that is consistent with the logic of connective action. That is consistent with the literature. Personalized action frames are really effective. Effective spectatorship, grief, attribution of blame, appreciation for rescue efforts. We see that is also well defined in literature on crisis and platform-mediated communication. Calls to action, which was something that we saw, for example, rage, donate, and etc. What is interesting is that many users took on the practice of active curation. So curating news, curating updates was something that these users were doing, and that constituted their contribution to humanitarian efforts. We see that governments and diplomatic representatives are prominent actors, and that sort of defies the disintermediation paradigm that we don't need institutions. We now have networked communities. Who cares about the international? But in fact, we see that international organizations, diplomatic accounts are still very prominent. We saw the inauthentic coordinated behavior and this human-animal bond, which was something that was interesting. So considerations going forward. Remote humanitarianism has never been a platform-specific phenomenon. It doesn't make sense to study it on a single platform. In fact, it's not even about the platforms in itself. It is just a reflection of what is happening perhaps on the ground. But of course, it's richly represented on platforms these days, and platforms have an accountability to not remove some of the content that would be helpful for people, either for their survival or for further investigations or things like that. From spectatorship, a lot of users have switched their behaviors to micro-influencing. It's another phenomenon where we are dealing with micro-influencers in the political realm, which aim to change public attitudes and behaviors about an issue. So there was a lot of public political discussion surrounding that incident, which meant that people did connect it to broader operations. For example, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, effective and visual storytelling, genres as key drivers of user engagement. We didn't really see it as much in the graphics that I showed you, but in fact, images and videos, many other genres such as memes. The whole TikTok is a memetic platform, which also probably is an interesting site to study networked humanitarianism. Something that I feel like is going to be more prominent and we need to pay more attention to, and kind of going beyond communicative practices overall towards the social infrastructures that underpin them would probably be something that I would call for in this 10 years after the connective action, on the 10th anniversary of connective action, I still think we need to get deeper than just platform mediated communication. With this, thank you so much for your attention. This is our team that has worked on this project, Justin Miller and Katerina Kasyanenko. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Olga, for spending time to explain both the very human context of the whole story and the technical side of your analysis. Very good. Our floor is now open. And let me see, there's two questions in queue. I will let them one by one. Jamie will go first, and then Jacob.
Hi, Olga. Good to see you again. Actually, we had a meeting before, and Olga kindly introduced me to another colleague in University of Sydney, which ended up, writing a grant together. So Francesco. I'm really grateful for that. And thank you for the presentation. I really enjoy it, especially this presentation from a sociologist point of view. Actually, you didn't over time anything about the context, so that was really inspiring and really timely. Enjoyed it. So I had a just basic question about probably I think if you have collected the data from Twitter, that might include some geocoding, right? So the geocoding, and because you talked about kind of the diaspora that's spread across the world, and you investigate kind of topics, what they talk about it, right? So I was thought about, if you had a chance to investigate some kind of, geographical variability in terms of the topics they talk about. Also, it got me think of some of the sociological concepts like cultural anchors, which the concept developed by Delia Baldassari and in her ASR article about social movement. So I think the humanitarian as a cultural anchor might connect diaspora widely spread across the world in terms of talking about, like the war and the dam instance and things like that. So I thought about the idea about how to juxtapose the topic as networks, but also kind of geocoding networks of people talk about. So probably I would be wondering about there's a users from specifically from Ukraine, also users from international, right? So that might be probably I don't know about the data availability, but that could make this interesting much more interesting. So that's my thought, and I want to hear your general thought about this kind of idea.
Thank you so much, Jimin. Really nice to see you, and really excited about your work with Francesco. So a geographic variability, definitely it's interesting. It would be interesting to map some of those discussions to see where they're coming from. It is a fact that many in Ukraine had registered Twitter accounts right in February 2022 because they felt like it was such a vital information source that they might not have witnessed it on their television or on the radio. So it was huge, and it was in fact a huge influx of Ukrainians. That would be interesting to see. We did not look at the metadata, the geotag. As you would know, it's something like 2% of all tweets would be geotagged, and there's a lot of discussion around whether the users who keep the geotagging on actually know that it's on, and whether they're systematically different in some ways, maybe less literate or more literate, or any kind of diversity of these users who keep the geotagging on. So we have not looked at that. But I have looked at diasporas previously in my previous projects. And the way I did that is I collected the discussion from the diaspora groups. So in a way that users who self-select into these communities, looking at what they're discussing, and humanitarianism was really prominent in those discussions. At the time, I was very enthusiastic, and I said, look, these are horizontal connections. People are just raising funds and directly benefiting communities in crisis, which was the case. But also, if you dig deeper and try to talk to these people, there's inevitably institutional intermediaries and mediators in one way or another. There's always also interesting continuity in seeing how some of these networked communities solidify over time, how they register nonprofits over time, Some of them run for office and form factions and actually work in the government and try to change something at a more systemic level. So it's definitely something that I was really interested in. I am now much more skeptical about the horizontal nature of these connections. They're all pretty still really mediated. But yes, the cultural anchors, thank you very much. I'll have a look into it.
Very good, Jacob, and then Eric.
Yes, hi, Olga. Thank you. Very great presentation. I'm empathize with your struggles to make sense of all those clusters, especially because just the way you list them, in terms of it just being, a type of unsupervised learning, I can see that like a lot of those clusters seem to be not totally independent or mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if there's a way in which first you could analyze it, say with like Chris Bale's approach to text networks, and you can kind of map the things out because they seem so different from each other. And then I think the best approach to it would, most productive approach might be to not try to come up with one theory to explain everything, but you could write several chapters or papers about different theories that pop up to you. Obviously, the one with the animals seems quite relevant to like the sociology of animals and also some transhumanist sociology, in the sense that for me, it would seem like the animals could be kind of a benchmark of the helpless creature, even more than children, because all humans, and to some extent, they led to all these catastrophes, even if you don't want, but we tend to assign less agency to animals. They consider them less responsible. So then they become a symbol of the ultimate suffering being within this conflict. And I think that leads to a lot of interesting interpretivist work you could do there. But I think, to validate that, the best step forward might just to start interviewing some of the people that made these posts and get an idea around what was their intentionality. And similarly, I've analyzed artists work with their own narratives. You can look at like, why did they text that, and why did they respond to that person's text? And then I think you have a stronger ground and basis for building up a theory from this data. I don't know if you'll get that far just like looking at the text data, no matter what kind of computationally sophisticated things you can do, but to bring in more participatory action sort of involvement with interviewees, understanding what would they mean to the people.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question and for your comments, Jacob. I absolutely agree. I mean, this was our first kind of stab at using Transformer, and sometimes it's a little frustrating to see, but overall, I do think that it did help us probably provide a snapshot of what kinds of things people were discussing with regard to this event that happened. So it's useful in seeing just what do we, as a networked public, talk about when some of this stuff happens, what kinds of narratives we construct, and so on. I do, in my other project, we're actually working on a kind of situational awareness approach and looking at the text networks. We do some automated named entity extraction, and then we have various attributes of different entities, seeing how they're linked with each other and trying to see sort of the structure of those conversations in a way that helps link them to more strategic narratives that might be, for example, propagated by states. So I do think that the network approach is helpful, and I do agree. I mean, we have done, so Katerina and I have done a series of interviews with some of the people who were involved in this networked engagement. I just didn't have the time to show that. We were really interested in what values drive their involvement. A lot of them don't have any Ukrainian heritage, which, going back to kind of Jay Min's comment, which did encourage me to depart from looking at just diasporas, because obviously they're going to be involved. They had been historically for the past 100 of years. But looking at maybe some more cosmopolitan, more humanitarian values of people who have no connections to Ukraine to get involved, and to what brings them into these discussions and what are they trying to achieve. So definitely will continue along those lines, and kind of always trying to be a little ethnographic in interpreting, or not, maybe not a little. I guess all the ethnographers are probably wincing right now and being like, I always combine and triangulate some of these approaches, and I do think it's extremely valuable. But also sometimes just on its own, just looking qualitatively at those posts and trying to understand kind of the timeline of what kinds of things people were discussing is helpful to understand how crises are represented in and out of itself. Thank you so much.
Great. Eric, please.
Yes. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I thought that was really fascinating, and I actually enjoyed the preceding questions as well. Comments. I'm Eric Kakula, visiting professor here at CUHK, and I'm so my comments are going to be a little bit disjointed, and I won't put the onus on you to make sense of my incomprehensible questions, but there are some different elements to it, and you might want to just pick or choose anything that you might like to run with. But as a kind of an overarching frame, I'd mentioned that several years ago, I was involved with a group of colleagues. We were looking at the possibility of putting together a proposal relating to the Internet of Things, and the way in which one might draw upon the Internet of Things to facilitate government response or response to disasters. And it's interesting, your colleague is Katrina, right? So we were actually looking at Hurricane Katrina, which
Katrina is here in the room with us, actually. Katrina, if you feel like it, please wait.
She's a story in and of herself, but what we did was we were kind of looking to kind of invert the traditional kind of response of when there's a typhoon or hurricane coming through a particular area. The traditional sort of mode of response is one of, the government kind of monitoring the storms coming closer, closer, and then maybe issuing bulletins, that are kind of broadcasted, right? And so this was reflecting a different era of technology, right? So it was a kind of a one-to-many sort of fairly messaging and updating, right? And so our thinking was, well, how might the fact that this kind of emerging Internet of Things is allowing, in a sense, these us to deal with this on an individual by individual basis, and to be thinking about the connections, right? That I might know that your 6-year-old daughter is in kindergarten over there, and that the route that you normally take to go get her might not be accessible, and then feeding very particularized information for you that would help, so it wouldn't be so much one to many, but it would be in this other sort of many to one, and then one back to many, but in many different ways. So I think you get the idea. So it struck me that there's some similarities to what you're doing, but also some very important differences. Now, in this context, I thought a key kind of thing is this idea of giving voice to, so in the sort of the old traditional version, these folks who are receiving the one-to-many broadcasts, they don't have voice. They have ears, but they don't have voice. And so one of the things that we did, I think it was at George Mason University, they had actually, after Hurricane Katrina, they had some grant funding, and there's a wonderful website that contains interviews. They went out and did field research, and they did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews with people who had been through that Hurricane Katrina, and there were some other ones there that they actually told their story. And so all of these transcripts were available. So one of the things that we had been pondering was, well, what could one do with these stories, because in a sense, these were giving voice, right? That now it's a different mechanism than the mechanism that you're using to give voice, and also perhaps a different kind of narrative, because a tweet sort of narrative is going to be different from someone after the fact recounting their experiences in a relatively coherent sort of narrative fashion. So again, forgive me for going on, but that made me, when you talked about your comment about you loved semantic networks, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and how they might apply in either case. And also in terms of the context of sort of analyzing these narratives, I'm not sure if the name of Roland Barthes means anything, but you know, I'm a fan of Roland Barthes. I don't claim to understand his work, but you know, he passed away quite a while ago. But he's a semiologist, and one of the papers, it's an incomprehensible paper, but I believe it's valuable, is called the structure of the narrative, where essentially he's talking about the same way that we diagram sentences, regardless of what the sentence is about, regardless about what the meaning is, there are certain structures that sentences have, subject, object, verb, etc. And he was doing that same thing, but at the level of narrative rather than at the level of sentence. And I'm wondering whether there's something in that that might be useful for the work that you're doing or the work that we were thinking about. And again, sorry to take so long.
Thank you so much for your comments, Eric, and for your question. So yes, for the past, since January, I've been trying different approaches to model narratives, and in the form of semantic networks, which are essentially co-occurrence networks, where two terms would co-occur in a sentence and therefore form an edge. And then you can also play with a threshold of co-occurrence and see, depending on the size of your corpus, right? You could raise the threshold and kind of see the most commonly co-occurring entities. And yeah, it's been a fascinating journey. I've done some literature review in automated narrative extraction. There are so many approaches. There are some of those more sophisticated approaches developed at Stanford, where they extract subjects and verbs and objects and then extract the nature of relationships between them. To be honest, that did not prove practical in our case. What had worked was super basic, extracting all nouns, mapping the entities on them, understanding which noun is a named entity, which is not, which surprisingly provides pretty detailed and granular context of what we're talking about. And even up to the point where we can distinguish some of the sort of Russian sources and their narratives from the international sources. It's quite granular, and I'm quite excited, but it's not an exact science. And of course, yeah, they're hard to map, but I've kind of tried many different things and will continue to look into it. There are, we're looking at corpus linguistics as well, because linguists have ways of mapping those structures. But again, it's proving it's a big ask. Yeah, so I do think that transformer-based architecture, it does help go beyond the just patterns in which that message is presented. So kind of sometimes there's some styles of writing or some ways of writing, or sometimes if you do, the traditional kind of LDA, you get like messages in a different language or somewhere separate. So transformer is more effective in that sense, that it does help. The clusters are more meaningful semantically, but of course there's limitations. But we're working on. We will see what we're able to validate and whether and to what extent it's insightful in trying to summarize some of the findings that we have discovered.
Excellent. My turn. Olga, I know that you have been working on warfare-related social science for quite some time. You have an award-winning dissertation with a very intriguing topic, civic participation in a mediatized warfare. Having done that as your dissertation, and then now studying the Russia-Ukraine war, what can you offer to me and other fellows from Computational Social Science Committee at CUSK, advice on both possibly barriers or facilitators in applying computational method in the context of modern warfare? Is it harder or easier, especially for computational social science? I know it's challenging for qualitative method, conventional, traditional social science method. What about computational social science? What lessons would you draw and share with us?
Thank you, Professor Tam. I have thought about this question a lot, especially as I'm in the process of starting a new project. It's a large funded project that looks at digital sovereignty, which is not that far from looking at mediatized war, because in fact, there are fascinating things that are happening with regard to digital sovereignty, with regard to internet connectivity and battles kind of in that realm, rerouting internet traffic, Elon Musk with his satellites. All those things are really affecting, so all the infrastructures are fundamentally affecting the ways in which a lot of these discussions are represented online. And that, I think, is the key. Well, the key thing that we should be paying attention as computational social scientists, because again, with connective action, it's so cool. We can gather all of the conversation on Twitter, congratulate ourselves on capturing it all and say that we're doing a great job. But in fact, there are strategic blackouts in the places where the most interesting things are happening. And that's strategic, right? So Russia had deliberately destroyed and tackled internet connectivity in places where, so if you remember, in the first days after Russia's full-scale invasion, there was a massive cyber attack on Viasat, which was the satellite that was providing internet connectivity on a large part of Ukrainian territory. That got out. So looking from the very, very deepest levels of physical infrastructure, how the internet is routed, what are the vulnerabilities, and how these vulnerabilities affect the kinds of things that even go out. So we've looked at the liberation of Kherson, which was, there were blackouts, and especially because Kherson was routed through the Russian internet service providers. Then once it got liberated, there was a massive blackout for almost, well, a day. There were very few messages about that. And then once people got back onto the Ukrainian internet, they started posting messages. We can even see the differences in language, because if all of the conversations are being censored by Russia, and if that puts people in grave danger, posting something like that from the occupied territories, of course they wouldn't. So I do think we should consider some of those more physical factors, infrastructural factors. And then also the other layer is the network layer, is the cyber layer, because there's a lot of cyber attacks that are happening to undermine some of these efforts, and we shouldn't disregard them. And we now see that Elon Musk is massively complaining about the cost of maintaining connectivity in Ukraine, exactly because of these cyber attacks. So I do think that we should consider some of the structural and infrastructural factors that determine some of the visibility, the volume, just the whole presence of online communication. And that's something that hadn't been particularly prominent. And I do hope to make a contribution in that area.
Right, those are very interesting things we normally would not think about. And now you have raised those things, those contingent factors that we usually won't observe, but may be quite common in warfare context. Then how do all these things affect potentially your data analysis, validation of data, and even when you see those clustering, bird clustering, or highly overlapped clusters of themes and so on, would that kind of knowledge about peculiarity of warfare help you or not help you, cannot help you in better approaching data or analysis of data?
I do think it's interesting to use the very traditional quantitative methods in drawing out some of those insights. So I would be very interested to use things like regression discontinuity when we know that there's been an event or when we know there's been outage. We can then see whether that outage correlates with the kinds of conversations that are happening on different platforms. And that is where clustering is extremely helpful, because it can help us perhaps parse out, roughly as it is, parse out some of the key distinctions. Like we found the Azerbaijani cluster, it was pretty significant and we could immediately see. And usually when we have orchestrated interventions, they're pretty obvious because they don't follow the patterns of the kind of public discourse and so, or the temporality, or sometimes we even have, so we have a paper with my colleague on we were modeling Hawkes processes, and so we kind of married Hawkes processes, put it on a transformer architecture, which is a content agnostic tool to look at the instances of orchestrated behavior, which has some pretty remarkable results, even to the point of identifying troll factories, separate troll factories that push different separate messages or different messages. So there are some of the, I think temporality is interesting here. I think when we know that something had happened at a certain amount of time, we can then try to see how it affects the other parameters. And I do think that those kinds of even correlation analysis, but also things like regression discontinuity, showing how some event has really caused a substantive, significant, or statistically significant difference in maybe some of the topics discussed. I think that's interesting. We can look at the different languages, and again, perhaps there is some interesting stuff there, as we saw with the liberation of Kherson. But that's, yeah, I guess that's, as computational social scientists, adding different dimensions, not flattening and not reducing, but actually visualizing things and adding different dimensions to observe some of these patterns might be interesting, or might be noise. That's always our key consideration. Is it meaningful? How meaningful is it? And is what we're seeing really representative of the phenomenon that we're studying?
Thank you. It's really challenging.
It is.
Yes. May I ask audience whether there are further questions for speaker? No? Apparently, yeah. Oh,
if no other questions, I guess that we still have a few minutes. So, yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. So, actually, you mentioned one challenge when you're analyzing the data from social media platforms, that is about authentic, coordinated behaviors. That I also very interested in that one. So there are some models and even like our Python packages to detect automatically about the coordinations. So the problem is that I don't think that it's a bigger problem to detect the coordinated behaviors, but the problem is how we know which one is inauthentic. So like this, I guess that is the common challenges for the network and movement studies, because there are real authentic coordinated behaviors. Otherwise, why we call it a coordinated network actions or network movement? I'm not sure that do you have any ideas that any insights about how to distinguish between the authentic and inauthentic coordinated behaviors? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Liang. That's a question that I have been grappling with since I got into bot studies back in 2016, as we all have, and it was a lot of literature on that, and I tried to make my contribution. And one thing that really bugged me, I guess, is the approach, the uncritical approach to what a bot is. And in fact, like you said, there's coordination that's happening sometimes organically, and surprisingly, it looks like inauthentic coordination a lot of the times. And who are we to judge? Is it authentic or not? Is it the nature of the accounts? Is it the structural differences between some of those accounts? So the transformer Hawkes architecture, it looks at the reaction of social systems. So trying to predict whether some content is part of like an influence operation based on how other people react, how other users react, which again, all of these distinctions are in a way somewhat deterministic, and they somehow suggest something about the nature of the actor that's doing it, which is not always true. So I am trying to step away from that. I'm trying to step away from saying, okay, we have identified these accounts are bots and they're propagating, because usually it's much more complex than that. And I think one thing is that the concept of a micro-influencer is actually really useful here, because we can see it as an agent or a user, or let's just call them an account, that elicits certain reactions from their audience. So it doesn't say anything about their nature or on whose behalf they're working, but we can see that whatever they're doing is really amplifying and propagating the information that they're trying to propagate. And so that's useful to not conceptualize these accounts as bots, but maybe as micro-influencing accounts, and maybe following some of them. And usually their connection to states and state-like entities are really difficult to prove. So what I've done in some of my work is I've looked at the actors with proved connections to, for example, the Russian military or the Russian intelligence, and seen how they present themselves, how they operate in the online spaces. And at least we know for sure that this is an account that has an affiliation and is acting on behalf of the state. And that's one thing that I think, looking more at micro-influencers without making those judgments of whether they're authentic or inauthentic, it's really important. The other thing is, I guess, the purpose, because that is where I guess we can make those connections and see how some of those micro campaigns do feed into the broader strategic narratives or not. And that does also help us, because what prevents, I think a few years ago, sociologist Phil Howard suggested in one of the interviews that we should make pro-democracy bots and we will be golden, because all the bad guys are making bots, let's just make a bot army to counteract. And then again, that sparked a lot of discussion about maybe that's the wrong, maybe we're tackling the wrong issue here. So I do think that kind of looking at the strategic communicative function of those posts does help us make those connections. And looking at the temporal patterns and the reaction of social systems, at least helps us identify some of the prominent actors in that space. And of course, I know about your work where you compared, I remember that you had this fascinating study where you compared the properties of retweet networks and reply networks, and kind of the different ways that it helps us model some of these phenomena. And I do think that that is very helpful in trying to connect some of those actors to the broader strategic information campaigns. I know this is probably not a very distinct answer, but that's just kind of the broader direction in which I think we should be researching.
Thank you. I also have no answer about that. I also was struggling about that. Yeah, I share some quite similar challenges with you. So, ask that question.
Excellent. Thank you again, Olga, for coming in after your dinner. We are before our dinner, but it's already after dinner in Sydney. And thank you so much for sharing your broad expertise in a challenging topic, and sharing your frontier work in applying computational social science to understand humanitarianism in a warfare context. That's really challenging and lots to learn. Look forward to seeing further discoveries you made using the method, and as well as a mixed up method. This is one of the nicest things. Hard to find talent, and we look forward to welcoming you in Hong Kong someday. Now that you have appeared multiple times at CXK online, so we should find a way to get you here and visit us. With that note, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this webinar, and wish all a nice weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.